Welcome to the Farm Family Harmony podcast. I'm Elaine Fraze, Farm Family Coach, here with another episode full of transition tips, tactics, and sometimes hard truths to get harmony on your farm. Hi there, folks. Welcome to another edition of the Farm Family Harmony podcast. And we have a repeat guest who's my favorite retired, not really retired accountant, Glen Dogterom, who is on our coaching team. And Glen has had many, many years of experience working with farm families. And today we want to hone in on how to be a great mentor for farm transition. So Glen, just give listeners a little background on your experience as a CPA with accounting firms in Southern Alberta, and where you're coming to this from is in terms of our coaching practice.
Sure. I've worked with farm families as an accountant and a financial planner for a number of years. And the focus was mostly, it started off with the accounting side of the practice, but very quickly started to morph into the full service. So that included a lot of farm transitions. And part of those farm transitions, those successful ones, was the mentorship role that the founders invariably provided to the successors. And the ones that were most successful had that good working relationship. And so, again, in my own practice, what I did is I was mentoring individuals who were coming up that were going to take over my clients when I left. And so I also had some experience there. And then the third thing I'd maybe quickly mention, I was part of a selection committee with the Cattlemen Young Leaders.
Right.
And so what we were doing is we were selecting candidates for mentorship. So what we were looking for is people who could be mentored, and they would provide a very quick overview of what they were doing and how they felt that mentorship would be a positive influence in their lives. And then as part of the selection committee, we chose 8 candidates for that mentorship role. So that was a really positive experience as well.
And I think that mentorship program with the Canadian Cattlemen is still ongoing.
Yes.
And is a very robust and very important program. So I have my 3 little baby rings here that we always use in our coaching discovery calls. And we talk about transition being the transfer of labor, management, and ownership. So where you and I are going to focus on this podcast is the management. How do we have good mentorship so that there is good farm transition and people can become managers, Glen? So you mentioned a good working relationship. So describe what you saw as the successful farms. Describe to me the character of the founder in terms of how they mentored. What does a farm founder need to embrace to be a good mentor for the transition of management?
Well, I would say that they need to have a few skills. They have to be a good listener.
Mm-hmm.
They have to be able to build trust. They have to have a encouraging demeanor, and they have to be reliable.
Okay.
And so those are some of the ingredients that I would say would be important to the process.
And so we have a tool that we use in our coaching practice called the conflict dynamic profile. And the last part of that tool talks about hot buttons or things that trigger things not going well in conflict. And so, someone who's a good listener will not be aloof because they will actually tell people what they're thinking, and they'll also listen well without trying to prejudge the outcome or possibly, I think, also decide what they're going to say while they're actually not listening. So being a good listener is not a hot button. That's the antithesis of of being aloof. And then you said being reliable. And that's actually one of my hot buttons, Glenn. I don't like it when people tell me they're going to do something and then they don't. So if we just took those 4 things that you just mentioned, that if you are listening to this as a founder and someone who wants to mentor the next generation, being a good listener, building trust, and having, you said, an encouraging demeanor. I would call that like an encouraging attitude. Also, being wired for positivity would be helpful there. And then being reliable. Those are all really strong characteristics. Now, when you're looking for a mentoring relationship, does it in agriculture, does it have to be your own parent?
No, and quite often it isn't. One of the things that I always recommended was that once an individual, and we'll talk about the successor. So when that individual is graduating from high school, the first thing that they have to do is go and get an education, whether it's in a trade, whether it's going to ag school, whether it's going to university. It doesn't matter. Just go do something and get an education. The second thing that I always recommended was go and work for somebody else for a minimum of 2 years. Learn how to be an employee from somebody who's going to have, hopefully, an independent attitude relative to what you're doing. Are you going to do a good job? If you don't, maybe you're going to get fired. But work for somebody else, and hopefully for an organization that has a very good structure to it, so that you can see how a larger organization is, structured and how it works. So those are the key things. And then you come back to the farm if you have a desire to be part of the farm, and you indicate your interest and start to participate. And then at some point, you say, okay, to your parents, I'm interested in a larger role. I'd like to take an equity position in the company or in the business. How do I go about doing that? What does it look like? And during this period of time, when they first come back, they may have driven a tractor in the past or whatever else, but there's a huge number of skills that they have to start to learn. They've got to understand the finance part of it. They have to understand some of the legal aspects of it. And the other part of it is, a huge part of it is the risk management. And that includes everything from, okay, like most farmers make their decisions about crop planting in the fall. And they arrange for their fertilizer in the fall. And then when spring comes, most of those things are already in place. It's just a matter of hitting the field and getting the crop in. So there's a number of elements on the practical level, but it's the bigger picture. It's the stuff that's not sitting behind the tractor wheel, which they may already have the skill at, but it's the business side of farming that you're really going to mentor. Come back to your point. Is your parent necessarily the best person? No, not always. If there's a certain amount of tension there, or if there's a certain amount of history of conflict, you probably want to reach out to somebody else. If the parent or the founders feels that, they can sit back and provide support, what you're trying to do as a mentee is to really become the best person that you can. And so you want to grow, and you want to develop skills that are going to help you to be the best farmer, businessman that you're capable of being. So that's really the mentee's role. And the mentor is to help them to get there.
And one of the tools that we have in our box, I call it the ultimate decision maker, but our role and goal as coaches is for the operator, the owner-operator, which we're calling the founder, and the successor, which we call the next gen, for them to understand all those different things that are happening. And I'm just going to flip here to my little implementation guide that I was using this week in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And I'll just hold it up here again. Dr. Baker did this at the University of Iowa, but it's got this university title. The title is Distributions of Managerial Tasks on the Farm, Founder and Successor Evaluation. So I call it the ultimate decision-making tool, because just what you said, Glenn, you talked about if there's conflict, not having your father or mother as the mentor is maybe a good idea. But ultimately, if your goal is to come back to the farm, you have to talk about who is planning the day-to-day work, who is making the crop and livestock plans, who is deciding the mix and type of the enterprise in the long run, what level of inputs to use, the timing, when to sell your crops to your livestock, when to pay the bills, when to purchase machinery, when to desire more help, when to recruit and select more employees, because labor is always an issue, amount and quality of work, and the list goes on. So I just want to give a shout out to the listeners. Is if you want this tool, we'll send it to you, and just ask for the ultimate decision-making tool, because I think it's also, you said the mentee needs to want to grow. And this kind of chunks down all the different decisions that a manager needs to start navigating. And our friend Dick Whitman at whitmanconsulting.com, he has another amazing checklist called the Farm Efficiency Checklist of all the things that you need to learn to be a good manager. And one of them is also to have a shared vision and business, right? So what happens, Glenn, when, because, you said, first of all, go and get a good education. 2 years, we tried to get our son Ian, he ended up actually in Alberta learning how to use a color sorter, but he never stayed away as long as we had hoped he would, because he was really pulled back to the labor on our grain farm. And that's always going to be the tension, isn't it? So what does a founder do when they're waiting for the next gen to come back? What is your suggestion for helping them not pulling the next generation back too soon?
Well, I think you nailed it. It does take some patience, because farm labor is always in short supply, and the children of most farmers have always been that source of labor.
Yeah, and groomed to come back.
Right. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to groom them to come back as a useful
skilled
of the farm family. And when you just move right directly from school right into the farm activities, you don't have a chance to really expand yourself. And so the education part of it, that gives you the academic or the intellectual capacity to apply different things. But it's really some of the practical experiences that you're going to learn over time. And that's where the mentor comes in. They've had all of these practical experiences, and if they can share them in a safe way. And the other thing that I would comment on here is that they have to, or they should allow whoever's being mentored to make mistakes. It should be a safe environment. Now, there's controls on those, because you don't want a mistake to jeopardize the farm or put at risk some component of it. But you want to allow an individual to try different ideas and to be in a safe environment to do so. And if it's a small mistake, that something isn't going to jeopardize the farm, as I shared, that's okay. Everybody makes a few mistakes, and one of the ways we learn is sometimes through those errors that happen.
And what about the idea too, Glenn, about having a small enterprise? Like, say, a young farmer goes off to Olds College or Vermilion, or in our case, our son went to the University of Manitoba to do his diploma. And they come back, or they've worked out for a couple of years with a different employee to learn all these things that you talk about. I just remember I wrote down here to share my John Deere filter story. So I had this young man in northern Alberta. Remember him clearly. He said, Lane, I am so frustrated. I used to manage 120 people in the oil patch, but my desire was always to come back to farm. And he said, the micromanaging that's happening here with my parents is unbelievable. I can't even buy a new $20 oil filter, John Deere filter, without having a huge discussion. And I'm just going, well, Charlie, you're going to have to navigate some more conflict resolution with your parents, especially your father, because there's, obviously a high degree of need to control here, which is I think why this whole discussion around how to be a great mentor raises a little bit of fire, especially for fathers, because they say, Elaine, I'm starting to feel beat up. Well, it's because you are the leader, typically, of this farm, along with your spouse, the woman as well, who's also very involved and, has financial transparency of what's going on. But how the person can come back when they're ready, when they've had this off-farm experience, when they've been seeing how another business has been managed, when they've also had Glen performance appraisals. Because that's another thing I think about mentoring is it's very rare for us to see a family business, a farm or a ranch, where the parents actually do performance appraisals on their own children. Right? Because you would get that experience, you would get someone giving you feedback. So another tool that I would put out in this podcast is just ask us for 9.2, which is, what are the strengths you're bringing back to the farm? What are the things you aren't good at that you shouldn't be doing? So what are your weaknesses? But the question number 3 that Dick Whitman has in this appraisal that he does, called 9.2, is how can management support you better? And so one of the things with Ranching for Profit does with their ranch families is they have executive link networks. And you mentioned, mentees have to grow and develop skills. And for our son, one of the best peer networks he joined was a marketing group of other young farmers in the next town over.
Yep.
So talk about how we can also use peer networks as a form of mentorship as well, I think, Glen.
I think that's an absolutely wonderful avenue to consider when you are doing this, because a friend of mine, when he was building his business, and it was a non-farmer, but nevertheless, the concept is the same. He joined a couple of different groups. One of them was an international group, and one of them was a Canadian focus group. But it was the same thing. They did strategic courses. When they got together, it was a very focused environment for them to all learn. They shared ideas and concepts, but the other part of it was an educational portion of it, which allowed them to take certain areas, whether it be finance, whether it be marketing, as you shared, whatever the idea was, is that they would focus on that for a period of time. And then when they met together the next time, they would take another avenue. But I absolutely applaud people getting involved in those. And one of the things that I have seen with our successful mentors, and that's the encouragement of their children to participate. And so if that happens to be in a cattle organization, cattle farm, that they belong to either the Alberta Cattlemen's Association, the Canadian Cattlemen's Association, whoever it is. And many of them sit on the board. Grain farmers, the same thing. Potato farmers, the same thing. We have lots of opportunity for young people to participate. And so it's the encouragement of them to get involved fairly early on.
I think that's the successful transition too, where people as founders and mentors can see how their roles are shifting and changing. They're not going away, they're stepping back, but they very much I would call it also, Glenn, have an intentional learning plan for themselves as leaders on the farm, but also an intentional learning plan for the next generation. And the one that you mentioned, so when you said that when these younger next gen people are coming back, they need to have a good idea of the finances.
Yeah.
And how can you encourage the frustrated young farmers listening to this podcast who are getting a lot of resistance around financial transparency when that's just such a deal breaker for people to understand, the inner workings of a business? And you and I think, are pretty much aligned that it's not a lifestyle. A farm or ranch is a business. And so how does a mentor get freer, Glenn, with the financial transparency piece? What should they be doing?
Well, one of the things, if you've got personal finances and where you say, hey, that's got nothing to do with the farm, okay, so be it. At some point of time, particularly when it comes to estate planning or whatever else, it should be on the table. But when we start talking about a business, and farming is exactly that, then there has to be total transparency. The books need to come out and they need to be shared openly, because what's going to happen is that without an understanding of what the financial numbers look like, where are your revenue sources, what kind of expenses am I getting, what kind of margins am I getting on my product, and what is the bottom line? Is there enough money being generated to support two families? If there isn't, can we change the operation in order to achieve that? And so the other part of that is that the mentee should start to be part of the group that goes and visits with the accountant, that sits at the table with the banker,
Yes.
so that they
Relationships. Because
absolutely,
another part of mentorship is developing those really important relationships.
very much so. Yeah, that is just a key element of it.
So, Glenn, what you said about what the revenue streams look like, I'd be curious to know what the number is now, because I heard a farm management specialist once say, excuse me, if you're going to bring back another person in your business on the farm, you need to generate another $500,000 of gross revenue for every family you bring back. Is that a low number now, do you think? Is that number higher?
Well, it probably is. And again, it's been a few years since I pushed those numbers. At one point of time, I would have said that would have been definitely the case. I think in some aspects of the business, the margins actually were not too bad for a few years. But traditionally and historically, we have gone through a period where there's fairly strong margins, but that doesn't stay for a long time. So I would say that number probably should be increased quite a bit, maybe in the $650,000 range of additional revenues that should be brought in. And one of the, it's sad, but as a founder starts to get a little bit older, their risk tolerance changes. And they're saying, well, gee whiz, the price of land is just outrageous. We can't afford to buy land. The problem is that if you don't continue to do an expansion of your operation, you're not in a position to really bring people back into the farming operation. Now, it may not be a land expansion. It may be a totally different aspect of it. So
diversification, assets, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, we're gonna change our crop mix. We're going to change the way we do things. Or alternatively, in some cases, people have gone off and said, okay, we're going to incorporate one of the individuals that we dealt with was building grain storage and selling it as a separate side of the business.
Right.
And there's all sorts of options that are available to people if they really start to look outside the box.
Well, and I had a conversation earlier today with our other coach, Lyle Weens, who also works with a marketing agency. marketing group, and he said, Elaine, some farmers refuse to grow oats because oats is itchy. And I'm thinking, oh, but oats at this point in time apparently is good on the numbers, right? In terms
Yep.
of profitability, more so he said than wheat. And that's just a very good example of people knowing their numbers and their costs of production. And I said, well, can't you put a Tyvek suit on or something? And jokingly, because I know my friends who are growing canary seed, it was profitable at the time, but they had to cover themselves to not be super itchy and be able to work with the product. So I guess it also depends how willing people are to make changes, because we have this saying in our practice too that says change is inevitable, growth is optional.
Yeah.
And I think that's a great way to look at, whether or not people are going to have the flexibility. But as people get older and their risk tolerance does change, would you also speak, Glen, to what bothers me about the assumption that the younger generation cannot manage debt? Because the younger generation has more time on their side to pay off the debt. But can you speak to the fact of, these farmers that are stuck in transition who say, well, Elaine, I'm not going to transition the equity? Because the other thing you said at the very beginning, Glen, was as these young people come back to farm, they want to increase their role beyond driving a tractor. They also want equity. But what is the plan on paper, or what is the understanding that at this stage and age, you can get 10% of the equity? When you turn 35 or 40, you can have 50% of the equity. I had an accountant once in Quebec. He's deceased now, but his name was Mario Dumas. And as an accountant, he would plan with families. When your son or child is 18, your daughter is 18, she gets 18, she gets this percentage, 10%, because of what she's already been doing on the business. And by the time they're 10 years older, they get a different percentage. So how do you navigate that transition of wanting to have equity, but also the parents not wanting to have risk of debt anymore?
Well, I think what happens there is that the successor needs to come in with an understanding. Where did dad grow their business? They basically grew it by acquiring additional land and taking risk.
Right. And mitigated risk.
Absolutely. But through a period of time, they had to take on debt. They had to take on additional risk relative to keeping the business viable, because at one point of time, half section or 3/4 of land was okay, even as a grain farmer. Well, it quickly outgrew that, and then it became a section, and then it became two, and whatever else. So, in order to just remain viable, not even successful, but just viable, you had to grow. And so when a young farmer comes on, the idea that they're going to, or they should be, looking at acquiring something at a cost. And so in some cases, I've had young farmers go out and buy quarters of land on their own.
Right.
Because they said, I don't want everything tied up with my family's business because I'm not sure at this point of time where that might lead. And I just want something that's mine.
It's equity they can grow in their own name.
Yep. And at some point of time, it may very well get rolled into the family business. But, and the other option again is if it's a large farm, then, hey, maybe the thing is that you start looking at taking loans out or whatever else and buying into the family business. So maybe you're going to acquire shares. Maybe you're going to acquire, if it's a non-incorporated entity, maybe you're going to actually buy a quarter of land from your parents.
Mm-hmm.
And, you're going to go to Farm Credit or your banker, and you're going to arrange financing, and you're going to make it work.
And you're also going to pay attention to your age, because you've gone to school, you've got a trade, you've got good skills, you have some off-farm side hustle in terms of mechanics or haying or custom operating or custom feeding cattle, all kinds of different things that you could do. You're also going to know that by the time you turn 40, Glenn, you're an old farmer. And so that's why I think this mentorship is so profitable as well. And Lydia Carpenter, who's also on our team of coaches, is very good at finding out grants about where you can source government money as a young farmer to help you build some of these enterprises where you can start getting your own economic traction. So again, knowing how to access those resources is really, really key.
And this is a little bit off topic, but I want to just kind of interject for a moment with it. And I have encountered farmers who have just held on to everything. And they're really, they had children that wanted to participate. And it eventually ended up leaving the farm.
Driving them away.
And so the farmer's sitting there in his 70s, and he said, well, I don't have any help. I can't make this work anymore. Yes, but you had children that wanted to help and wanted to start taking on a larger role. You wouldn't allow them to. So that mentorship starts early on.
Yeah.
And it goes through years. I mean, it's not a short-term. What's some of the programs, it's a year in duration or whatever else. But something like this is a multi-year type of an arrangement and relationship. And it really is that.
Well, Glenn, I think just in closing, we'll circle back to where you started, because you said a great mentor for farm transition has good working relationships, which includes being a good listener, and ongoing good communication never stops, right? We all can get better. You also said it takes a person willing to help build trust. And I think you gave some very practical examples in terms of you build trust by being financially transparent. And in Nick Whitman's world, when he was working with farm families, he said, oh no, Elaine, if you're in business with someone, you know everything, all of the business finances and all of the personal finances. Because I remember speaking last fall to the CanWest Veterinary Conference, and this young, older veterinarian who was in a transition said, Elaine, it just took us sideways when we found out, as we were trying to buy out the partner, of how rack and ruin his personal finances were. And they had no idea, right? Because it was never talked about. Well, when you're in business with someone, the more you can talk about, the more you can listen, the better off you're going to be. The other thing you said was having an encouraging demeanor, and that's the positivity. I think also on how you take on risk, Glenn, that you don't always think the worst thing is going to happen, but you are prepared for bad contingencies, right? And so that legal aspect, the risk management, and of course we could spend, we'll get Lyle on this podcast because he is a marketing specialist, but also to just talk about, how you do what you say you're going to do. So I'm pretty sure there's a saying that, pity the man or woman who hangs on so tight to all their gold that no one wants to come and break bread with them, because the horse is out of the barn 20 years later. And so for all of you listening to this who are in your late 30s, early 40s, the time is now for you to think about how you're getting equity. But for those of you who are listening in your early 20s and you haven't yet gone back to the farm, or you're wondering about what life is going to be like, these are some really good tips that you've shared with us today, Glenn, and really appreciate your decades of experience. And I also am thinking of some young farmers that you've worked with in our team, that you spent 14 hours with this one young farmer to really get really clear on how much he could afford from his operation to buy out his father for the transition. And you're thinking 14 hours, but yes, because what you did for him is you gave him extreme clarity on where the boundary lines had to fall for the expectations of that working relationship and the ongoing financial success of that farm. So thanks for joining us today. And for all of you listeners who want more tools from us at farmfamilycoach.com, just reach out and ask for that ultimate decision maker sheet that I read off and ask us for 9.2. And we look forward to hearing your comments, and also just really curious with podcasting and the fun of listening to podcasts. I was driving home from South Dakota the other day and listening to Beyond the Crops with Mary P. Sass and Jen, and I was listening to Tracy Burnett, and Evan Choate talking, and you always learn something from what other people are doing. So keep on listening and keep on learning, and we'll see you next time. Bye for now.